Before this story had a courtroom name, before it became a case people whispered about as the Woodchipper murder, it was a cold November night in Connecticut. A storm had come through. Roads were slick, trees were down. Near a steel bridge by the Housatonic River, witnesses would later place a rental truck and a woodchipper in the dark hours before dawn. At the center of it all was a woman who was missing from her own life. Helle Crafts was a mother. She was a flight attendant. She was planning a divorce. And by the time the police began to understand the shape of the evidence, the question was not simply where Helle had gone. It was whether the state could prove that she had been murdered, when the person accused of killing her seemed to have left almost no body at all. This episode is based on public court records. Public record readings are dramatized readings, not real interview audio, and no real person's voice has been cloned. The court record cannot give us Helle Crafts in full. No judgment can do that. It can tell us what witnesses said, what investigators found, what the defense challenged, and what a jury was allowed to infer. But a life is more than evidence. Helle was not an exhibit. She was a woman with children, a job, friends, fears, and plans. By late 1986, her marriage to Richard Crafts was coming apart. According to the Connecticut Supreme Court's summary of the evidence, Richard Crafts' continued extramarital affairs had become part of the crisis. Helle contacted an attorney. She began divorce proceedings. She hired a private detective. The detective carried out surveillance and confirmed that Richard was involved with another woman. Helle had proof. She had plans. And she told people close to her something that would matter later. If anything unusual happened to her, they should not believe that she had simply made it happen herself. That detail sits quietly in the record, but it changes the emotional weather of the case. It means Helle understood that leaving might be dangerous. It means the people around her had already been asked, in effect, not to accept a convenient story.
Public record reading. The Connecticut Supreme Court wrote that because of the defendant's continued extramarital affairs, Helle contacted an attorney and began divorce proceedings against him. She hired a private detective who carried out surveillance of the defendant. The detective confirmed that the defendant was involved with another woman and presented Helle with photographs of the defendant's activities. The court also wrote that Helle was extremely devoted to her children, was planning to seek their custody, and would not under any circumstances have left them voluntarily.
The last confirmed sighting in the opinion is simple, almost ordinary. On November 18, 1986, Helle was dropped at home by a coworker. That is the kind of line that appears in a judgment with no music under it. Last seen or heard from, dropped off at home. But in a documentary, we have to stay with the ordinary for a moment, because ordinary is what vanishes first. A person finishes work. A person gets a ride. A person goes home. Then the record changes. The next morning, November 19th, Richard Crafts took the children and the family's live-in au pair from the house at 6 in the morning. He said there was no heat because of a power failure during the snowstorm. The court noted that the home had alternative sources of heat. It also noted something else. When Crafts brought the children away, Helle was not there, and he did not ask where she was. The prosecution would later ask a jury to see that morning as more than a strange family errand in bad weather. It would ask the jury to see it as part of a plan already underway. Plans leave paperwork. Rentals leave records. Purchases leave witnesses. And in this case, The prosecution built part of its case around things that happened before and just after Helle disappeared. The court summarized evidence that Crafts had arranged for the rental of a woodchipper, the purchase of a truck to haul it, and the purchase of a large freezer. He picked up the freezer on November 17th. He wanted to pick up the woodchipper on November 18th, but was not able to do so until November 20th, when he got access to a rental truck. The timing mattered. The state did not have a single photograph of what happened to Helle. It did not have a living witness to the killing. It had a sequence: marriage trouble, divorce, warnings from Helle, the last night, the children removed, the freezer, the truck, the woodchipper, and then the bridge.
Public record reading. The court wrote that on the evening of November 20 and into the early morning of November 21, several witnesses observed a woodchipper being pulled by a rental truck at various locations in the general area of the defendant's home, and additionally near the offices of his part-time employer, the town of Southbury. At 6:30 in the evening, the woodchipper, operated by a single individual, was observed near a steel bridge in Newtown. Between 3 and 4 in the morning, the woodchipper was observed at various locations in the vicinity of the same steel bridge, again operated by a lone individual.
The bridge became the place where absence turned into evidence. Investigators searched near the river. They found wood chips. They found an envelope with Helle's name on it. They found blue fabric, similar to clothing she had worn. Then the search became smaller and harder to say out loud. Pieces of bone and tissue, a human fingernail, dental crowns. Underwater near the bridge, police recovered a chainsaw belonging to Richard Crafts. From the chainsaw and a separately recovered blade, investigators recovered blood, tissue, hair fragments, and cotton fibers. The court described some of the material as partly matching the riverside remains, and the blood, tissue, and hair fragments as categories matching Helle. In a lesser production, this is where the music would swell and the story would become a spectacle. We are not doing that. These were the remnants of a person. The forensic story matters because it helped the state answer a legal question, but the human fact is simpler. Someone had tried to make Helle disappear so completely that the law itself might struggle to name what happened.
Public record reading. The police found pieces of bone and tissue, a human fingernail, and crowns to Helle's teeth. The police also recovered, underwater near the steel bridge, a chainsaw that belonged to the defendant. From the chainsaw and the separately recovered saw blade, they recovered blood, tissue, hair fragments, and cotton fibers. Some of these remains partially matched the material discovered at the riverside. Furthermore, the blood, tissue, and hair fragments were of categories matching those of Helle.
After Helle vanished, Richard Crafts offered explanations. The court described them as various stories and said they were demonstrated to be incorrect. He told some of Helle's friends that she had gone to Denmark to be with her ill mother. Later, he suggested she might be visiting friends overseas. When police interviewed him on December 4th, he indicated he had last seen Helle on November 19th and that she might be visiting a friend in the Canary Islands. These details matter because false explanations can become evidence of consciousness of guilt. They are not by themselves proof of murder. People lie for many reasons. People panic. People hide affairs. People evade embarrassment. But in this case, the statements did not stand alone. They stood beside the divorce, the rentals, the bridge sightings, the physical fragments, the chainsaw, and one line the court found significant enough to preserve. When told about state police divers, Richard Crafts replied, Let them dive. There's no body. It's gone. The law would have to decide what that sounded like. A responsible story has to include the defense position. Richard Crafts maintained that he had not killed his wife and that he did not know where she was. On appeal, the principal issue was the sufficiency of largely circumstantial evidence. That phrase can sound technical. It means the defense was arguing, in effect, that the evidence did not prove the necessary conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. There was no ordinary body. There was no eyewitness to a killing. Much of the state's case depended on inference. If Helle would not have left voluntarily, if she vanished after a night at home, if Crafts made preparations involving a freezer, truck, and woodchipper, if a machine was seen by the bridge, if human remains and Helle-linked items were found there, if a chainsaw belonging to him carried matching material, then a jury could connect those facts. The defense position asks us to remember that an inference is not the same as a recording. The prosecution position asks us to remember that direct evidence is not the only kind of proof.
Public record reading. The principal issue in the appeal was the sufficiency of largely circumstantial evidence to support a conviction of murder. The Supreme Court of Connecticut affirmed. In its summary, the court said the jury could reasonably have found the facts described in the opinion, and that the state's evidentiary showing was enough to sustain the murder conviction.
The Crafts case became famous partly because of the machinery. That is the part people remember. But the deeper reason the case lasts is legal and human. It showed that a body can be almost destroyed and still leave a trail. It showed that circumstantial evidence, if it is strong enough and connected enough, can carry a murder conviction. And it showed something darker about domestic violence and control. Helle was planning to leave. She was planning to seek custody. She had told people not to believe an easy explanation if something happened to her. Those are not side notes. They are the part of the case that turns a strange forensic story back into a story about risk. Many homicide cases begin long before the final act. They begin with isolation, power, money, jealousy, fear. And the moment one person decides that another person's freedom is intolerable. The court record does not use that language. It does not have to. It gives us the pieces and asks whether a jury could put them together. There is another reason to spend time with this case slowly. When people hear the phrase "no body murder," they sometimes imagine a legal loophole. No body, no crime. But that is not the law. The law asks whether the state has proved, beyond a reasonable doubt, that a death occurred and that the accused caused it with the required intent. A body can be powerful evidence, but it is not the only evidence. In this case, the prosecution did not ask the jury to trust a single clue. It asked the jury to look at a pattern. Helle's plans to divorce, her devotion to her children, her warning to friends, the last confirmed evening, the unexplained morning removal of the household, the freezer, the woodchipper, the truck, the sightings near the bridge, the fragments in the river area, the chainsaw, the contradictory stories. The remark about the divers. Any one of these facts might have an innocent explanation. That is what defense lawyers are trained to test. But criminal trials do not always turn on one fact. Sometimes they turn on the force of many facts leaning in the same direction. In the end, this is not a story about a machine. It is a story about Helle Crafts, and about what happens when a person is almost erased from the world, and then reassembled through testimony, search teams, dental evidence, fabric, blood, and memory. That kind of reconstruction is necessary in court, but it is also incomplete. We know Helle through the record because the crime took away the rest. We know she was planning a future. We know she cared deeply for her children. We know she took steps to leave a marriage that witnesses and evidence described as broken. We know a jury convicted Richard Crafts. We know the Connecticut Supreme Court affirmed that conviction. And we know this: the effort to make Helle disappear failed. Not because the evidence was clean, it was not. Not because the case was simple, it was not.
It failed because enough fragments remained for investigators, scientists, witnesses, lawyers, jurors, and judges to say her name back into the record. Helle Crafts. Not a rumor, not a missing person story conveniently explained away. A person whose life mattered and whose death the law was able to recognize. When a court opinion says a marriage deteriorated, it can sound bloodless. But deterioration is a lived thing. It is meals eaten in silence, phone calls lowered when someone walks into the room, friends noticing that a person is planning, quietly, to get out. The record says Helle contacted an attorney and began divorce proceedings. It says she hired a private detective. It says the detective confirmed Richard Crafts was involved with another woman. Those facts are legal facts, but they also describe a woman trying to convert fear and suspicion into something she could act on. Divorce is often treated as paperwork. In domestic violence and coercive control cases, leaving can also be the moment of greatest danger. We are not adding facts beyond the record here. We are naming the risk pattern that makes the record feel so urgent. Helle was not vanishing from responsibility. According to the court, she was moving toward responsibility. Custody, documentation, proof, a plan. The children appear in the legal record because they help answer a question the defense could raise. Could Helle have left? The court's summary says she was extremely devoted to them and planned to seek custody. That matters because missing person explanations often depend on a story of voluntary disappearance. Someone needed a break. Someone ran away. Someone went overseas. Someone left the life they had made. Sometimes that happens. Adults can disappear by choice. But the jury was entitled to consider whether that explanation fit Helle. The court said the evidence allowed the jury to find that it did not. That does not mean every detail of the family's private life becomes public property. It means the prosecution had evidence that Helle's relationship with her children made the voluntary departure theory harder to accept. In a case with almost no body, motive, and behavior around the disappearance had to do more work.
The snowstorm is not just atmosphere, it is part of the timeline. On the morning after Helle was last seen, Richard Crafts moved the children and the au pair out of the house, saying there was no heat because of a power failure. The court noted alternative heat sources. That detail is not cinematic by accident. It gives the jury a way to test the explanation. Was this an ordinary emergency response during bad weather, or was the storm useful cover? The court did not need to decide every private minute in the house. It asked whether the jury could reasonably infer that Helle had already been killed during the night and that Crafts was executing a plan to conceal the crime. A storm can hide sound. It can change routines. It can put people indoors. It can also create an explanation that sounds plausible at first hearing. That is why investigators do not just ask whether a story is possible. They ask whether it fits the rest of the evidence.
Forensic evidence can sound absolute when it is summarized in a podcast. Blood, tissue, hair, fibers, dental crowns.
But courts are careful with categories and limits. The opinion did not say that every fragment solved every question. It said some remains partially matched the material recovered at the riverside, and that blood, tissue, and hair fragments were categories matching Helle. That language matters. It is not television certainty. It is legal sufficiency. The state built a chain from many links: Helle's disappearance, the defendant's access to machinery, sightings near the bridge, remains and personal items in the same area, and material on a chainsaw belonging to him. If you remove the qualifiers, the story becomes cleaner than the record. If you ignore the evidence, it becomes weaker than the record. The responsible place is in between. Enough to convict, according to the jury and appellate court. Still built from fragments, not from a single, perfect proof. No body cases create a special discomfort because death itself has to be proved without the ordinary symbol of death. The law does not require a complete body. It requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That proof can come from circumstances: a person's habits, plans, last sightings, physical traces, inconsistent statements, forensic evidence, and conduct after the disappearance. But because the stakes are so high, courts must guard against speculation. A person can be missing and alive. A person can lie and still not be a murderer. A suspicious purchase can be innocent. The legal question is whether the total evidence crosses the threshold. In State v. Crafts, the appellate court said it did. That does not make the case simple. It makes it a powerful example of how the justice system handles attempts to destroy evidence at the most basic level, the body itself. The public memory of this case often reduces it to one phrase: the Woodchipper murder. It is an unforgettable phrase, but it is also a trap. It turns a woman's death into a device. It makes the machinery more famous than Helle. It risks making the listener feel the case is grotesque before they understand why it matters. A better way to remember the case is as a convergence of domestic risk, careful investigation, forensic recovery, and circumstantial law. The Woodchipper is part of the evidence. It is not the point. The point is that Helle had a future she was trying to reach. The point is that someone tried to erase the proof of what happened to her. The point is that investigators found enough fragments and prosecutors connected enough facts for the courts to hold the conviction.
Public record reading. The state charged Richard B. Crafts with murder by killing his wife, Helle Crafts. After an earlier trial resulted in a mistrial because of the jury's inability to arrive at a verdict, the state retried the defendant, and a jury found him guilty of murder. The trial court rendered a judgment sentencing the defendant to a term of 50 years imprisonment. The Connecticut Supreme Court affirmed.
The investigation also asks something of the listener. It asks us to tolerate uncertainty without filling it with invention. We do not have Helle's private thoughts on tape. We do not have a final conversation. We do not have a complete body. What we have is the work of reconstruction. That is why the public record distinction matters. When this episode uses a source reader voice, it is not pretending a witness sat down in a studio. It is marking the difference between narration and record. It is saying, here is what the court preserved. Here is what the prosecution argued. Here is what the defense denied. Here is what the jury was permitted to find. True crime often blurs those lines because blurred lines feel dramatic. But blurred lines are dangerous. They can turn grief into performance. They can turn allegations into certainty. They can turn a person
into an atmosphere. Helle Crafts deserves better than atmosphere. The case deserves clarity. Appeals are not second documentaries. They are narrower. The appellate court does not sit in the jury room and decide whether it personally would have believed every witness. It asks legal questions. Was the evidence sufficient? Were the rulings lawful? Was the conviction supported by the record? That matters here, because the opinion is not a full biography and not a full transcript. It is a legal map. It tells us which facts mattered to the sufficiency question. It tells us why the court believed the conviction could stand. And because this case is so easily reduced to its most grotesque image, the appellate structure gives us a more disciplined way to tell it. Start with what the record says. Keep the defense position visible. Avoid pretending we know more than we know. Then ask the harder question. When someone attempts to remove the body, how does the justice system decide what remains? Think of the case as a chain of inference, because that is how circumstantial proof works. The first link is motive and context. Helle was moving toward divorce and custody, and Richard knew it. The second is opportunity and timing. Helle was last heard from after coming home, then disappeared before the household was moved out in the early morning. The third is preparation. The freezer, the truck, and the woodchipper were not vague rumors. They were part of the state's evidence as summarized by the court. The fourth is movement. Witnesses saw a woodchipper and rental truck near the bridge in the hours that mattered. The fifth is recovery. Personal material and human remains appeared in the area where the machine had been seen. The sixth is contradiction. The stories about Denmark, overseas travel, and the Canary Islands did not hold. The seventh is consciousness of guilt, the remark about divers and the absence of a body. The defense could attack each link. The jury could also decide the links held together. There are things this episode will not say. It will not invent Helle's final words. It will not make a synthetic witness sound like a real person describing the bridge. It will not stage Richard Crafts as a villain in his own invented monologue. It will not turn court findings into horror narration. That restraint is not a lack of drama. It is the discipline the case deserves. The facts are severe enough. The record is disturbing enough. The most respectful version of the story is also the clearest one. A woman was preparing to leave. She vanished. The state alleged her husband killed her and destroyed her body. A jury convicted him. The state Supreme Court affirmed. Everything else has to serve that truth, not compete with it.
Helle's case asks why evidence matters after a person is gone. Evidence cannot restore a life. It cannot raise children with the parent they lost. It cannot undo fear or betrayal or the last night inside a house. But evidence can resist erasure. A receipt can speak. A witness sighting can speak. A dental crown can speak. A blood trace can speak. A contradiction can speak. A court record can speak. None of those voices is Helle's. That absence is the grief at the center of the episode. But together, the evidence prevented the story from ending with a shrug and an explanation about a woman who supposedly walked away. It forced the legal system to look at fragments and say, this was not disappearance. This was murder.
Measured production note. This episode is a public record documentary based primarily on State v. Crafts, the Connecticut Supreme Court decision affirming Richard Crafts' conviction. Public record readings are dramatized source readings performed by synthetic voices. They are not real interviews, not archival recordings, and not cloned voices of Helle Crafts, Richard Crafts, witnesses, investigators, lawyers, or family members.